Hello, my name is Arshnoor Tung and I'm an economics student at the University of Calgary. My summer research was on the effects of COVID-19 on the race and gender earnings gap. Focusing on Black and white Americans, I utilized the consumer population survey data from 2020 and 2021 to compare changes in annual earnings for the four racial gender groups, from pre-pandemic to early pandemic levels. So why study the earnings gap? Studying the effect the pandemic has had on the racial gender earnings gap allows us to better understand and cover whether some racial gender groups were economically impacted more than others. My paper contributes to the growing studies on wage disparities as I reconstruct the racial gender earnings gap and focus on analyzing how the gap evolves with the onset of the pandemic. In this paper, earnings are defined as an individual's total income from wages and salary. Based on raw weighted median annual earnings, Black women make the least, while white men make the most. The pandemic had little to no effect on the median earnings for all groups. But the lack of change in median earnings does not necessarily mean that no changes occurred within the race-gender earnings gap. Within the earnings gap, there were significant changes in the distribution for all groups. Based on the graphs, gender has a larger influence in determining the distribution in earnings than race, and the distribution of Black persons was impacted more by the pandemic than white persons. Methods. With my econometric model, I ran weighted regressions on the software program's data. I conducted separate regressions for 2019 and 2020 and compared the coefficients for race, gender, and their interaction terms. My results showed that the negative return to earnings due to either race or gender was reduced from 2019 to 2020. This means that race and gender had a smaller negative effect on predicting earnings with the onset of the pandemic. The racial effect dropped from 15.5% to 14.4% in 2020, while the negative gender effect dropped from 16.2% to 14.1%, while the penalty for Black women grew slightly by 1.3% with the onset of the pandemic. The decrease in the negative impact of race and gender during the pandemic can be attributed to a multitude of factors. Unemployment shifts the distribution of earnings, and due to being more likely to be working part-time and low-wage jobs, which were the first to be laid off, racial minorities and women were more likely to be employed. Furthermore, while the pandemic negatively affected female-dominated industries such as services and retail, other male-dominated industries such as construction and transportation were also adversely impacted. Prior to the pandemic, men with children made 20.7% more than those without children, and women with children made 12.7% more than those without. With the onset of the pandemic, the positive effect of kids on earnings decreased by 13% for men from the previous year, while women faced a total decrease of 39.2%. The unexplained gap refers to differences in earnings that are not accounted for by differences in characteristics. From 2019 to 2020, the racial unexplained gap increased. This jump suggests that the pandemic exacerbated differences in return for productivity variables based on race. The gender unexplained gap also increased. In both years, the explained gender gap is negative, which implies that if women had the same characteristics as men, they would be making less. In summary, the COVID-19 pandemic reduced the effect of race and gender on earnings, while the combined effect of gender and race for Black women increased from 2019 to 2020. Additionally, the unexplained gap for gender and race increased, which implies that more of the differences in earnings due to race and gender are not explained by differences in characteristics, and may be due to an increase in discrimination. Finally, the pandemic reduced the positive effect of children on earnings of working parents, with mothers facing the largest decline. Why does this matter? By failing to address the intersection of race, gender, and the pandemic within income inequality, the full extent of discrepancies within the earnings gap for individuals with disadvantaged identities remains undisclosed. Ultimately, the pandemic affected the earnings of women and racial minorities differently, and it is important to acknowledge this. I would like to thank my supervisor, Dr. Amr Hashmi from the U of C Economics Department, for their guidance and patience. I would also like to thank the PEER program for making this research possible. Thank you.